There is a detail from Stephen Peck's home life that says almost everything about what the Peck family holds sacred. Stephen, the second son of the legendary actor Gregory Peck, has two dogs. One of them is named Tango. The other is named Atticus Finch, after the character his father played in To Kill a Mockingbird, the quiet, principled, small-town lawyer who taught a generation of Americans what decency looked like. And that small, tender choice, naming a beloved pet after a father's most famous role, captures the whole complicated inheritance the Peck children carry. Because to the world, Gregory Peck was Atticus Finch, the most beloved father in the history of American cinema, the very image of moral goodness. And to his own children, by their own testimony, he really was more or less that same man at home. But here is the truth that the perfect on-screen image conceals. A movie ends after 2 hours. Real families do not. The credits roll, the lights come up, and everyone goes home to a life that keeps moving, with all its accidents and heartbreaks and second chances still ahead. Gregory Peck lived to be 87. And across those decades, he was not only the world's idea of the ideal father, he was an actual father to 5 real people who loved him, worried him, made him proud, and, in one shattering case, broke his heart so completely that he never fully recovered. Their lives held extraordinary accomplishment and quiet heroism. They also held addiction, political defeat, and one loss so devastating that Gregory Peck himself called it the greatest sorrow of his life. That is the paradox at the center of this family, and of so many famous families like it. We look at the fortunate, the gifted, the beloved, and we assume their good fortune must extend to every corner of their lives, that a man who was adored by the whole world and admired as the very picture of integrity must surely have been spared the ordinary sorrows that visit the rest of us. But fame and goodness are not a shield. The Peck children were born with every advantage a person can have, and it did not protect them from despair, from addiction, from defeat, or from loss. Their story is proof, if any were needed, that no amount of privilege can exempt a family from being human. Their names were Jonathan, Stephen, Carey, Anthony, and Cecilia, the 5 children of Gregory Peck. And their story is a powerful reminder that even the most decent man in Hollywood, even the father the whole world wished it had, could not protect his children from everything. This is a story of fame, of loss, and of legacy. And it begins with the eldest son, the golden boy whose story is the hardest one to tell, because it is the one that ended far too soon. Jonathan, the son they lost. Jonathan Peck was born in 1944, the first child of Gregory Peck and his first wife, Greta Kukkonen, a Finnish-born woman who worked as a makeup and hairstylist. At the time Jonathan arrived, his father was just becoming a star, one of Hollywood's handsome young leading men during the war years, and the household around the boy was a rising one, full of promise. Jonathan's parents divorced when he was around 8, and like so many children of Hollywood marriages, he grew up navigating the strange currents of a famous, fractured family. And by every account, Jonathan was a golden child in the most literal sense. He was a track star in high school, a genuine athlete with natural gifts. He was ambitious, curious, and adventurous, and he threw himself into a life of purpose rather than privilege. He joined the Peace Corps and spent 2 years serving in Tanzania, far from the comforts his father's fame could have handed him. He served for 6 years in the Marine Corps Reserves. He graduated from Occidental College, and then he chased a career that suited his sharp, inquisitive mind perfectly. He became a journalist. Jonathan began in radio, working at KNX in Los Angeles for about 3 years, learning the craft before moving into television as a local news correspondent for a station in Santa Barbara. By the mid-1970s, he was building exactly the kind of independent, self-made life any father would be proud of. A career earned entirely on his own merits, under a last name that could have opened every door for him but which he seemed determined not to lean on. Colleagues who knew him described a smart, driven young man who wanted to be judged for his own work, not for whose son he was. He was, by all appearances, thriving. And then, in 1975, at the age of just 30, Jonathan Peck died by suicide. There is no way to soften that fact. and it would be wrong to try. The details have always remained largely private, held close by a family that has, understandably, chosen not to turn its deepest wound into public spectacle. What is known is that his death came without the kind of warning that might have allowed anyone to intervene, and that it landed on his father like a collapse. Those close to Gregory Peck have described it as the single greatest sorrow of his life, a grief that never fully lifted, that he carried quietly beneath the composed public dignity everyone associated with him. And this is one of the cruelest truths hidden in the whole Peck story. The way this kind of pain can conceal itself behind an ordinary, even successful exterior. From the outside, Jonathan's life looked like a triumph. The resume kept building. The career kept advancing. Whatever he was carrying, he carried it where no one could see it, behind the poise and the promise, in a place none of the people who loved him could reach in time. Here was a man the entire world looked to as the very embodiment of steadiness and moral strength, Gregory Peck, and he could not save his own son. No amount of fame, no amount of love, no amount of anything could change what had happened. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it cuts against the entire myth we build around the fortunate. We look at a figure like Gregory Peck, and we assume that a life that gilded must be a life protected, that the children of the beloved and accomplished are somehow shielded from the ordinary catastrophes that befall the rest of us. They are not. Depression does not check a person's last name. Despair does not care how kind your father was. And the terrible truth at the heart of this family's story is that the most decent father in Hollywood still had to bury a child, and still had to live nearly 30 more years carrying a loss that no role, no award, and no ovation could ever touch. Those who knew Gregory Peck said the loss made him gentler afterward, more present with his other children, more aware of how fragile even the strongest seeming life can be. Jonathan's death became the quiet, permanent shadow at the edge of the family portrait, the absence that shaped everything that came after. And it makes what his younger brother chose to do with his own life all the more remarkable. Because Stephen Peck came home from a war and decided to spend the rest of his days making sure other people would not be lost the way his brother had been. Stephen, the soldier who saved the broken. Stephen Peck was born in 1946, the second son of Gregory and Greta, and his path would take him somewhere almost no other child of Hollywood royalty ever went. He went to Vietnam. This was no small thing, and not only for the obvious reasons. Stephen's father, Gregory Peck, was one of Hollywood's most prominent liberals, an outspoken opponent of the Vietnam War, a man who used his considerable public standing to argue against the very conflict his son would go on to serve in. Imagine the tension inside that household. A father, famous around the world for his moral clarity, publicly protesting a war, while his own son puts on the uniform of a Marine and ships out to fight it. It could have torn a family apart. By most accounts, it did not. Stephen served, and his father, whatever his politics, stood by him as a son. It was, in its own way, a living demonstration of the very principle Peck had played on screen so many times, the idea that you can love someone completely while disagreeing with them profoundly. Stephen came home from Vietnam changed, as nearly everyone who went there did. And rather than bury what he had seen, he turned it into the defining mission of his life. He became an advocate for Vietnam veterans, producing films on veterans' affairs, and eventually he found the cause that would consume his best decades. He devoted himself to homeless veterans, the men who had served their country and then fallen through every crack in it, ending up on the streets, forgotten by the nation that had sent them to war. Stephen became the president and chief executive of USS Vets, which grew into the largest organization in the country dedicated to serving homeless veterans, providing housing, counseling, job training, and a path back to dignity for tens of thousands of men and women. This is not the kind of work that lands a person on a magazine cover. It is the work of showing up, day after day, to a problem that never fully solves, of finding beds for men who have slept under freeways, of sitting across from someone whose war never really stopped and convincing him his life is still worth rebuilding. It is slow, grinding, and heartbreaking, as often as it is triumphant. Think about the quiet grandeur of that choice. Stephen could have done anything. He carried one of the most respected names in American culture. He could have coasted on it, traded on it, chased the spotlight his father lived under for half a century. Instead, he spent his life in the least glamorous work imaginable, sitting with broken, traumatized former soldiers and helping them find their way home. There were no premieres, no ovations, no golden statuettes for the thousands of veterans Stephen Peck helped pull off the streets. There was only the work itself and the lives it saved. And it is impossible not to hear the echo of his own family's tragedy in that work. Stephen had watched his older brother, a Marine himself, a man of promise and service, be lost to a private darkness. And then he spent his life throwing ropes to other men, drowning in exactly that kind of darkness. The veterans crushed by trauma and despair. Nobody in the family ever framed it that way publicly, and Stephen was far too modest to claim it. But the shape of it is unmistakable. Out of one family's deepest grief came a lifetime of pulling strangers back from the edge. There is a kind of alchemy in that, the transformation of private pain into public good, and it may be the most quietly heroic thing anyone in the Peck family ever did. Many people who lose a sibling to despair are simply broken by it, and no one would blame them. Stephen took his loss and turned it outward, into decades of showing up for the men society had given up on, men who might otherwise have ended the way his brother did. He could not save Jonathan, so he saved, as best he could, everyone else he could reach. It is impossible to know how many veterans are alive today because of the organization Stephen Peck built. But the number is surely in the thousands. An entire hidden monument to a brother who was lost. Stephen also became a father, welcoming a son who would carry the family into a new generation of Hollywood. But we will come to that. For now, it is enough to say that of all Gregory Peck's children, Stephen is the one people most often point to as having most fully inherited his father's moral core, the sense of duty, the instinct to use one's position on behalf of the powerless. He did not play a hero on a screen. He simply was one, quietly, for decades. Today he is remarried to a food writer and editor, and he lives a life of substance and service, with 2 dogs, one of them named for the character that made his father a symbol of goodness. If Stephen carried his father's conscience into the world of veterans, the 3rd son carried it somewhere else entirely, into the messy, bruising public arena his father had only ever flirted with. American politics. Carey, the son who ran for office. Carey Paul Peck was born in 1949, the youngest of the 3 sons from Gregory's first marriage. Like his brothers, he grew up in the strange gravity of a famous household, and like them, he showed little interest in simply cashing in on it. He made a cameo or 2 in his father's world, but the screen was never where his ambitions lay. Carey wanted to change things, and he came to believe the way to do that was through public service. He graduated from Georgetown University, served in the Peace Corps, following the same idealistic path his late brother Jonathan had walked, and then went to work in the office of a United States senator, focusing on matters of education. And then, in the late 1970s, he did something genuinely bold. He ran for the United States Congress as a Democrat in Southern California. Here, the famous last name became both a blessing and a burden. It opened doors and drew attention, but it also invited the inevitable skepticism that trails the children of the famous into any serious arena. Was he a real candidate? Or just a movie star's son playing at politics? His father, a lifelong Democrat who had himself been floated as a possible candidate for governor of California, supported his ambitions. Carey ran hard, and he ran close. He mounted 2 congressional campaigns, in 1978 and again in 1980, against the same Republican incumbent. And both times he lost. Both times by slim margins. Anyone who has ever poured themselves into a campaign that falls just short knows the particular ache of that outcome, the months of door-knocking and fundraising and speeches, the volunteers who believed in you, the raised hopes, and then the narrow, deflating defeat on election night. To do it once takes courage. To pick yourself up and do it all over again, knowing exactly how much it can hurt, takes something more. And to lose a second time, by a margin thin enough to keep you awake at night, wondering what a few hundred votes might have changed, is its own particular heartbreak, the kind that can sour a person on public life forever. Carey absorbed those losses, and then he did something that says a great deal about his character. He did not disappear into bitterness or trade on his name for an easier life. He did not become the cautionary tale of the famous son who never found his footing. He went to work, and eventually he found his way to the cause that would define his later decades: education. For years, Gregory Peck has worked as a principal analyst for the Los Angeles Unified School District, one of the largest school systems in the nation. And within that unglamorous role, he has become a genuine force for good, helping to pioneer after-school programs designed to reach the students the system too often leaves behind. He has championed initiatives aimed at drawing girls and disadvantaged kids into science and technology education, into fields that had historically shut them out, working on programs designed to open real doors for young people who needed them. It is a quiet second act, but a deeply meaningful one, and it fits the family pattern almost perfectly. Where the father used a movie screen to model justice and decency, the son used a school district to actually deliver it, one after-school program at a time, to kids whose names will never appear on any marquee. Carey married the acclaimed environmental and installation artist Lita Albuquerque, building a life rich in creativity and purpose, and he became a father several times over. He is remembered by those who work with him not as a movie star's son, but as a tireless public servant who genuinely cares about giving overlooked children a fighting chance. 3 sons from the first marriage, then. 3 lives shaped by service and idealism, and one shattering loss at the center of them. But Gregory Peck's story did not end with that first family. In the mid-1950s, he met a woman who would change the course of his life, and together they would have 2 more children, whose paths would carry the family in dramatically different directions, one toward the very edge of self-destruction, and one toward some of the bravest storytelling of her generation. Anthony, the son who nearly lost himself. In 1953, while filming the beloved romance Roman Holiday in Europe, Gregory Peck met a young Parisian journalist named Veronique Pisani, who had come to interview him. 6 months later, he asked her to lunch, and by every account, they became inseparable. He divorced his first wife in 1955 and married Veronique that same year, beginning the second great chapter of his personal life, one that brought him a deep and lasting happiness that endured until his death. Together they had 2 children, a son, Anthony, born in 1956, and a daughter, Cecilia, born in 1958. Anthony Peck, known to nearly everyone as Tony, grew up immersed in the glamour of his father's world in a way his older half-brothers never quite had, because he was the child of Peck's settled, prosperous, movie star middle age. He spent summers on his father's film sets, absorbing the intoxicating rhythms of the industry from the inside. He was educated at the finest institutions, graduating from Amherst College and then the Juilliard School, that legendary training ground for performers. Everything was in place for a smooth and privileged ascent into the family business. Anthony did pursue a career in entertainment, working as an actor, writer, and producer over the years. But his story took a darker turn than anyone would have wished, because the very fame and access that surrounded him from birth proved to be as much a trap as a gift. There is a particular danger that catches so many children of the very famous, and Anthony seems to have walked straight into it. When everything is handed to you, when doors open before you knock, and money is never quite real and consequences always seem to land on someone else, it becomes terribly easy to lose the thread of who you actually are. By multiple accounts, Anthony struggled for a long and painful stretch with addiction, with drugs and drinking, the kind of self-destructive spiral that has swallowed so many children of Hollywood who grew up with too much within reach and too few limits on it. There were real fears within the family that he might follow the same tragic path that had taken his half-brother Jonathan, that the darkness might win. His personal life bore the marks of that turbulence. He married the supermodel Cheryl Tiegs, and for a time the union placed him squarely in the glossy celebrity spotlight, a fixture of the very tabloid world his father had always regarded with wary distance. But his struggles reportedly strained the marriage, and it ended in divorce, a very public unraveling that by some accounts left him reeling. It also strained his relationship with his father, that steady, principled man who had already lost one son and now had to watch another one flirt with ruin. There is a particular anguish in that, and it is easy to imagine the private conversations, the worry, the helplessness of a father who could play a rescuer on screen, but could not simply script his own son back to safety. And yet Anthony's story, unlike Jonathan's, did not end in tragedy. He became a father himself, welcoming a son in the early 1990s. And fatherhood, along with the hard work of recovery, seems to have given him something to hold on to. He steadied. He rebuilt. He stepped back from the brink that had once seemed so terrifyingly close. His is perhaps the most human arc of all 5 siblings, the story of someone who was handed everything, nearly lost it all, and then found his way back. It is not a fairy tale, and it does not pretend to be. It is simply the real and difficult account of a man who inherited a golden name and had to learn, the hard way, that a name cannot save you. Only the work of saving yourself can do that. If Anthony's path ran closest to the edge, his younger sister took the family's inheritance, its conscience, its love of storytelling, its instinct to stand up for the voiceless, and forged it into a career that has quietly become one of the most morally serious in modern documentary film. Cecilia, the daughter who told the hard truths. Cecilia Peck was born in 1958, the youngest of Gregory Peck's 5 children and his only daughter. She was, in many ways, the child who grew up closest to the legend at his most fully realized. The daughter of the man who had already become an icon, already won his Oscar for playing Atticus Finch, already settled into the role of elder statesman of American film. And it is Cecilia who has spoken most warmly and most publicly about what her father was actually like at home, describing a man who was kind, loving, strict when he needed to be, and genuinely, unmistakably good. The best and most loving father in the world, in her own words. When she said that of all the children in the world who wished they had Atticus Finch for a father, she was one of the lucky few who actually did, she meant it literally. Cecilia began her career in front of the camera, as an actress. She appeared in films through the 1980s and early 1990s, including Oliver Stone's Wall Street, and she earned a Golden Globe nomination for her performance in a television film in which she poignantly played the daughter of a character portrayed by her own father. There is something almost too fitting about that. The real daughter of Gregory Peck, cast as the daughter of Gregory Peck. For a while it looked as though she might build a conventional Hollywood acting career, but something in her, that same restless moral seriousness that ran through the whole family, pulled her in a different direction. She moved behind the camera, dedicating herself to documentary filmmaking, and specifically to the kind of documentary that shines a light on injustice and on the people brave enough to confront it. Her subjects tell you everything about her values. She began by turning the camera on her own father, producing an intimate portrait of the man during his later years, when he toured the country doing evenings of storytelling for audiences of every age. It premiered at the Cannes Film Festival, a loving daughter's gift to the world and to her father both. From there, her work grew steadily bolder. She co-directed Shut Up and Sing, a searing documentary about the ferocious backlash the Dixie Chicks faced after one of them criticized the president over the Iraq War, a film about the price of speaking your conscience in public. Then came the film that may define her legacy. Cecilia directed and produced Brave Miss World, which followed Linor Abargil, an Israeli model who was attacked just weeks before being crowned Miss World, and who spent years afterward on a courageous crusade to confront her attacker and break the silence surrounding sexual assault, reaching out to survivors around the globe. The film took years to make, and it became, for countless viewers, something more than a documentary. Survivors wrote in by the thousands, many of them speaking about their own assaults for the very first time. It became, in the truest sense, a lifeline. Cecilia followed it with Seduced. Inside the NXIVM cult, a harrowing series about the women who escaped a criminal organization that had trafficked and abused them. Look at the through line in that body of work. Every one of Cecilia's major films is about someone standing up against overwhelming power on behalf of the vulnerable, about survivors, about conscience, about the courage to tell a truth the world would rather not hear. It is, when you think about it, the exact moral territory her father spent his career exploring on screen, the lone, principled figure standing against the crowd. Atticus Finch defended the defenseless in a courtroom. His daughter defends them with a camera. The medium changed. The mission did not. There is something genuinely beautiful in that continuity, because it reveals what the real Peck inheritance actually was. It was never about fame or money. or the family name opening doors. Gregory Peck's most famous role was a man who did the right thing when it was hard and unpopular, who stood up for someone the whole town had condemned, simply because it was just. That was the value Peck himself seemed to hold most dear, and it is the one value that passed most powerfully to his children. Stephen lived it with his veterans. Carey lived it with his overlooked students. And Cecilia lives it, film after film, giving a voice and a platform to people the powerful would prefer to silence. She married a writer, and the two named one of their children Harper, in honor of Harper Lee, the author of To Kill a Mockingbird, the novel that gave her father his greatest role. That single detail says almost everything about how consciously this family carries its own legacy, how deliberately it braids together the art and the values and the love that Gregory Peck left behind. Fame, loss, and legacy. More than 2 decades after Gregory Peck died peacefully in his sleep, in June of 2003, at the age of 87, his surviving children remain bound together by the extraordinary father they shared, and by the very different lives they each built out of that inheritance. Jonathan is gone, lost in 1975 at just 30, and his memory remains the quiet, sorrowful heart of the family's story, a reminder of the one grief that all his father's fame and goodness could never undo. Stephen spent his life at the helm of the nation's largest effort to house and heal homeless veterans, one of the most quietly consequential humanitarian careers any child of Hollywood has ever led. Carey moved from the campaign trail to the school system, spending his later decades opening educational doors for the children the system too often ignores. Anthony survived the addiction that nearly consumed him, rebuilt his life, became a father, and continued to work in the film world, his story one of hard-won recovery rather than easy privilege. And Cecilia has become one of the most morally serious documentary filmmakers of her generation, telling the stories of survivors and truth-tellers, and raising a family that carries the Peck legacy forward with obvious pride. And the legacy did not stop with them. It reached into a third generation, most visibly through Stephen's son, Ethan Peck, who has carried the family name back onto the screen, even taking on the iconic role of Mr. Spock in a modern Star Trek series, stepping into roles his grandfather might have marveled at. Other grandchildren have become teachers, artists, and professionals, several of them quietly honoring the family's history, in a small, touching echo of everything the name has come to mean. One of Gregory Peck's great-grandsons was given the name Atticus, the family passing down, quite literally, the goodness their patriarch came to symbolize. It is tempting, when we look at Gregory Peck, to let the myth swallow the man, to see only Atticus Finch, the perfect father, the calm and towering figure who always knew the right thing to do. And by his children's own testimony, there was more truth in that image than we have any right to expect. He really was, at home, something very close to the man he played on screen. But the fuller story, the one his 5 children actually lived, is richer and sadder and more human than any movie. It includes a son lost to a darkness no father could reach. It includes another son who came home from war and spent his life saving the wounded. It includes a public servant who kept serving even after the voters said no, and a son who nearly destroyed himself before finding his way back, and a daughter who turned her father's on-screen conscience into a real-world weapon against injustice. It includes fame and loss and legacy, all tangled together the way they are in every real family, famous or not. That, in the end, may be the truest thing the Peck children reveal about their father. Not that he raised a perfect family, because no one does, and this family knew grief and addiction and public failure as intimately as any, but that he raised, mostly, good people, people who took the enormous privilege they were handed and tried, each in their own flawed and striving way, to turn it towards something decent. A veteran's shelter, a child's classroom, a survivor's story finally told, even a life pulled back from the edge. Gregory Peck spent his career teaching audiences what goodness looked like from the safe distance of a movie screen. His children spent their lives trying to actually live it, in a world with no script, no retakes, and no guarantee of a happy ending. And given everything they each carried, that effort may be the finest performance the Peck family ever gave. The subject of suicide and addiction touched on in this story is a serious one, And if you or someone you know is struggling, please know that support is available and that reaching out for help is always worth it. If you found this story moving, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more of these fascinating and human stories.